All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our August webinar. My name is Connor Wrighton with the Northwest Gas Association. Our last webinar tackled a big energy industry buzzword, which was blockchain. And we're going to go back to the buzzword well again, once again this month with electrification. There's a lot to unpack on this subject, so we're really pleased to present this as a two-part series featuring Richard Meyer of the American Gas Association. Richard, sir, excuse me, we are one slide too far. Richard serves as the Managing Director of Energy Analysis for the American Gas Association, and he's also a terrific Twitter follow for anyone who's interested in the going-ons of the natural gas industry. Today's webinar is going to focus on the implications of electrification, while next month we will address pathways forward for natural gas. Before we begin, let's review the basics for how these webinars work. As always, we have set aside plenty of time for questions, and we strongly ask that you ask those questions as they come up. Each of you will be muted throughout the presentation, so please use the text box in the GoToMeeting control panel to type out those questions, and I will interject as needed to introduce them. Those of you who are on our webinars regularly know that I do my best to police the mute buttons, but if you could keep an eye on that yourself, there's in the audio portion of your GoToMeeting control panel, there's a mute function, and I would appreciate it if you would go there and do that yourself on the front end. For those of you who would like a PDF copy of this presentation, please send me an email. You can respond to the email that I sent out with the code to get in earlier, or you can just shoot me an email at creiten@nwga.org. I'll do my best to get a copy out before the end of business today. The presentation is also being recorded and will be posted to YouTube this afternoon. Okay, let's see. Mute somebody there. Yep, so we will post this to YouTube this afternoon. Again, reach out for that link as well. Or you can just visit the Northwest Gas Association YouTube page where you can see our whole cache of webinar recordings. As some of you know, the Northwest Gas Association hosts webinars like these each month. Again, we're going to be doing part 2 next month. Signing up for this webinar does not automatically sign you up for part 2, so please visit nwga.org to sign up for the one on September 20th. We also have, I'm really struggling here with these slides. We also have a terrific lineup of webinars coming up in the months following. We're going to do an NGV for transit. Dan Kirshner is going to do his annual Outlook study. There's going to be a post-midterm election policy update from DC. We are in the process of posting all of those to our website, so if you want more details on any or all of those, please go to nwga.org and sign up for any or all of those. Finally, I'd like to introduce the Northwest Gas Association for those of you who may not be familiar with us and what we do. We represent the 6 investor-owned gas utilities operating in the Pacific Northwest, along with the 3 large natural gas transmission lines. Our members are located in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia. As always, please visit our website for more information or shoot me an email if you have any questions. But with that, we're going to pass things over to Richard, and I will get the screen over to him right now.
Thank you, Connor. Let me get this going. Just a sound and video check here. Does everything look okay?
Everything looks perfect.
All right, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Connor, and the Northwest Gas Association for the opportunity to speak with you all today. This is the culmination of more than a year's worth of effort and analysis, working with the consultancy ICF that helped us with this study, as well as a group of AGA members that guided through this process. I'll go through all of that. Just very briefly about my role at AGA, I'm Managing Director of Energy Analysis. Our team is responsible for the statistical collection, data analysis, and importantly, the policy analysis that supports all areas of advocacy across the association. This topic of residential electrification, I know is very important to many of our members, many of the folks and companies out in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest. And so I'm really looking forward to sharing some of our findings in this effort. First, I want to just step back and before I dive into any of these slides, make just a definitional, just define what is it that I'm talking about when I refer to policy-driven residential electrification, which is what this report, which is what the study is about. Policy-driven residential electrification refers specifically to direct or indirect legislative or regulatory actions that would require residential space and water heating fueled by natural gas, fuel oil, or propane to be replaced by an electric alternative. The underlying idea is that as the grid gets cleaner over time, as the grid decarbonizes, the use of electric devices in lieu of direct use fuels, such as natural gas furnaces, can create greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And we see a number of proposals out that we should have gone to the next slide. We see a number of proposals introduced out there looking ahead towards how we will continue to achieve greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and in particular, this idea of deep decarbonization. We've noticed a shift in trends in the types of policies proposed to continue to reduce GHGs in our energy economy and across the entire U.S. economy. And I throw a number of these policy proposals or analyses up just as an example of where we're seeing this issue come about. And so this is, the idea of deep decarbonization, and within that sphere, within that idea is the concept that the electrification of building end uses can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and help us put us on a pathway towards deep decarbonization. So we see this idea from a number of environmental groups. This was part of the policy proposal put forward by the Obama administration in the waning days of 2016 after the election. The White House, the United States mid-century strategy for deep decarbonization, one of the planks within that policy proposal was energy efficiency within buildings and the electrification of end uses within buildings as a means towards deep decarbonization. So this was very much on the national policy front until the election changed the political environment here in Washington, D.C. Nevertheless, this continues to bubble up. Despite the politics in Washington, D.C., we've seen these conversations continue at states and municipalities. This is very much an upwelling, a bottom-up interest in continuing to drive towards greenhouse gas emissions reductions. A number of cities and states have pledged to continue to adhere to the goals outlined by the Paris Climate Agreement, even though the U.S. has said it will pull out. And so although climate action was the keen focus of the Obama administration and not so much with the Trump administration, this continues to be an issue on a state and local basis. There are active policy discussions in California, Oregon, and Washington out your way. We see this happening in Virginia, New York, Massachusetts. Electrification of building loads came up in a big way, even in Ontario, where the provincial government there, after hearing advocates push for this idea, were very much going to include that in their energy planning. So we see these policies bobbling up all over the place. However, while policy-driven electrification has been discussed in multiple venues, there has been little to no analysis on what we see to be the costs, potentially the benefits, but importantly, the implications of residential electrification. Let's level set just a couple items here before we dive into the elements of the report. One, we need to recognize and remind everyone that I talk to when discussing this topic, that natural gas provides a tremendous amount of energy to customers, not just on an annual basis, but on a peak basis when they need it most during the peak cold of the winter heating season. More than 68 million households, residential households, use natural gas today. Just about 60 million, which is shown on the chart here, 60 million use natural gas for their primary space heat. That's more than any other fuel. We would look at the greenhouse gas emissions impacts of that energy use. Residential natural gas only accounts for about 4% of total greenhouse gas emissions as of 2016. By the way, I'm including a share of upstream methane here so that we're not ignoring some of the upstream impacts. I allocated that out, and it's still 4% of all greenhouse gases are associated with residential natural gas use. If you include propane and fuel oil, you can add a couple percentage points onto there. By contrast, you can see what the residential electricity consumption, or the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the power sector allocated to residential electricity. That accounts for about 11% of total greenhouse gas emissions. So what were our foundational findings as we started to peel back this issue and scope out the report and think through these issues? One kind of immediate aha moment was just how much energy natural gas delivers to customers on a peak basis. And what's shown here is just an illustration of how winter generally requires much more energy than summer. I think this is true in the Pacific Northwest. It's generally true when you average across the entire United States. And what this chart is showing is that, a recent winter peak, January of 2014, the entire U.S. residential sector over that month used more than 2 times the total energy that the same sector, the residential sector, used in the summer. In other words, we're using a lot more energy in the winter than we are in the summer. So if we're going to electrify all of those end uses, we need to get our arms around what that's going to mean for customers and what that's going to mean for peak system requirements. So that brings me to the report itself. We called it the implications of policy-driven residential electrification. As I said, this is a culmination of a year's worth of work. We worked with ICF, their consultancy based here in Fairfax, Virginia, out east, that is. This effort was guided both by AGA staff, but very importantly, a steering committee comprised of 24 different AGA member companies. That's included a broad geographic representation. So we had folks from the Pacific Northwest to the South, the Northeast. We wanted to make sure, because this can be such a regional issue, we had as much input from as broad a geographic base as possible. This report was released in early July, and let me just dive into some of the questions first that we asked as part of the scoping of this study. 5 main questions as we think through this idea of policy-driven residential electrification. 5 questions we set out to answer through this effort. 1, will policy-driven residential electrification actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions? The answer to this question is it depends on where you are. In some states, even by 2035, residential electrification does not reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions. And this is predominantly in parts of the U.S. where we anticipate coal and natural gas to be a substantial part of the electric grid mix. So in other words, replacing end-use devices fueled by natural gas and replacing with electricity does not reduce emissions. However, in other parts of the country, and that includes parts of the West, parts of the Northeast and the South, there may be emissions reductions, potential emissions reductions with residential electrification in the year 2035, which is where our study went extended out to. More about that in a second. Second question, how will policy-driven residential electrification impact natural gas utility customers? And quite simply, we found that policy-driven residential electrification would be burdensome to consumers and would increase average residential household energy-related costs. I'm going to apologize to all of you right now. I'm going to be saying policy-driven residential electrification a few times over and over. In fact, I want to make sure I'm saying all of those things. So we're very clear about what we're talking about, that this isn't market driven and that we are focused on the residential sector, that we're not talking about the transportation or even commercial and industrial, that we're focused on space and water heating in the residential sector, and that this is a policy driven, this is the study of a policy that would drive this. Back to the questions, what would be the impacts on the power sector and on electric transmission infrastructure requirements? And we find that widespread policy-driven residential electrification will lead to increases in peak electric demand in every region of the country and would result in the need for significant new investments in the electric grid infrastructure, including generation, transmission, and distribution capacity. Question 4, what would be the overall cost of policy-driven residential electrification? The costs would be significant, and this work suggests a total cost to the economy somewhere between $600 billion and $1.2 trillion. So that's based on the 2 different cases we analyzed. More on that in a second. Let me be very clear that these should be seen as conservative estimates, as there are a range of costs that we did not address. 5th, how do the costs of policy-driven residential electrification compare to other approaches to reduce emissions? And finally, what we found is that policy-driven residential electrification would be a very costly approach to emissions reduction, and it is much more expensive relative to other greenhouse gas reduction options. Let's talk about the key study inputs, and you know what, let me start on the right-hand part of this slide. What is the electrification policy? How do we define that? In this case, we assume that starting in 2023, no new fossil-fueled furnaces or water heaters would be sold in the U.S. That's effectively what it means. In other words, starting in 2023, all new homes are built with electric, space, and water heating equipment, specifically conventional air source heat pumps and heat pump water heaters. Similarly, starting in 2023, looking at the existing market, direct fuel use, space and water heating, so fuel, oil, propane, natural gas, they would all be replaced with electric systems at the end of the effective life of that current system. And again, we're using air source heat pumps and heat pump water heaters in that case. On the left, some of the key study inputs. You need a base case in any of these types of analysis. What are you starting with so that you can look at the changes? What are the incremental changes as a result of this electrification policy? We are using the annual energy outlook from 2017. This is a fairly conservative outlook, depending on your various views of the future, but we wanted one that was transparent, open, publicly available, and fairly widely understood, if not always agreed upon. I will make one note that in the 2017 annual energy outlook, the Clean Power Plan was still intact. It was still policy at the time that outlook was developed. So that is included, and the effects of the Clean Power Plan are included. In other words, the future generation mix in 2035 may be more aggressive than if we assume the Clean Power Plan was not out of it. So in terms of a future grid mix, it may be somewhat more clean. It may be cleaner or less carbon intensive than it would have been otherwise. We had to estimate heat pump efficiencies to get a sense of both the average and peak requirements for electric space heating systems. And in order to do that, ICF did a careful analysis using temperature data from 220 different locations to effectively create a peak and average efficiency for the electric heat pump systems. We use projected equipment costs and for space and water heating based on publicly available data, as well as data available in the annual energy outlook. And finally, we have 2 electric generation cases. So, okay, we're going to electrify a bunch of end uses, but how then are we going to meet those upstream requirements? And let me just talk very briefly about those 2 cases, and we'll dive into some of the details in a minute. We have a renewables only case. In this case, the electric system was constrained from adding any new fossil fuel capacity in order to meet incremental demand associated with electrified space and water heating in the residential sector. So that's not to say no new natural gas is built. New natural gas was part of the annual energy outlook reference case that was being built. We're just not adding any more new natural gas on top of that, on top of that baseline. Whatever results, that incremental results associated with electrified space and water heating. So renewables only, we're not building new natural gas, we're only building new renewable capacity, and battery capacity as a firming resource. We found that ended up being fairly expensive. That was the high cost case. So we also did a market-based generation case. And in this scenario, we allowed the model to select any available electric generation resource. In other words, we allowed new natural gas to be built. And the costs come down, but the emissions, because the power sector emissions might now have more natural gas as part of the mix, the greenhouse gas emissions overall might be higher than they are in the renewables only case. Let's get into some of the results. I got 4 or 5 slides with some charts, and I'll go through these fairly quickly, but there are a lot of details on these that I invite you to look at both in the report and in the or on the PDF of this presentation a little later. Going back to some of the findings, we need to recognize that the total greenhouse gas reduction potential from policy-driven electrification is small. Again, if we just looked at the natural gas slice of overall greenhouse gas emissions, natural gas only accounts for 4%. And so if you're going after a piece of that 4%, it's going to, well, it'll be necessarily less. And we found through widespread, aggressive policy-driven residential electrification, you only reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 1 to 1.5% in terms of total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in 2035. This is a mix of, well, 2 things happen. One, you have a change in, I guess, customer-cited emissions, or rather direct fuel emissions in the household itself from primarily the combustion of fossil fuels. That gets reduced because you're removing those fossil fuel devices from homes. But we see a commensurate increase in power generation emissions as natural gas and existing natural gas, and in the market-based generation case, new natural gas steps in to meet the new peak electric loads associated with these this new electric demand. So that new power sector emission, those power sector emissions offset some of the gains that you might see in the residential sector. And those net change in emissions depend on which scenario, whether it's the renewables only or if you include natural gas in the electric mix in the future. Make sure it's all on here. A very kind of simple finding that I think helps get our arms around what this electrification issue means for the residential sector and for the power sector in particular is that if you electrify the entire residential sector, it could potentially nearly double the U.S. electric grid's peak hourly demand. So you've got today, the U.S. is largely a summer peaking system, and the winter peak is somewhat below that. We've got about 1,000 gigawatts of capacity in the U.S. today, and the historical peak electric demand in the summer is around 856. That's that purple bar on the right. There's ways you can build up that, but when you electrify all end uses, both which includes all of the electrification we assumed in our policy case, plus all other end uses that weren't electrified by 2035, you get nearly a doubling of the potential electric grid peak hourly demand. And again, that's only from electrifying the residential sector. We're not looking at transportation. We're not looking at commercial or industrial. That's just the residential sector. And you could potentially double the size of the U.S. electric grid, or rather the peak electric grid requirements.
Hey, Richard, do you mind
Yes,
hitting hide on that bottom go-to meeting thing? I think we're missing some of the bottom of the x-axis labels there. Perfect. Thank you.
I didn't even realize you could see that, so my fault.
No worries.
Oops, I shouldn't have that number on the bottom. Excuse me. Again, back to the customer impacts, we find that policy-driven residential electrification will be burdensome to the economy and to consumers. Let's talk about the overall cost to the economy first. When we're thinking about the magnitude of the costs of policy-driven residential electrification, the costs are a function of a number of different things that we evaluated. We have consumer energy costs, so that's as households switch from natural gas and other fuels to electricity. You've got both the capital cost for the equipment installation, so how much more it might cost for an electric heat pump versus what an efficient natural gas furnace might have been, as well as the energy costs associated with switching from from gas to electric. So what's the differential there? And of course, that depends on what part of the country you're in. There's also the upstream requirements and the costs associated with that. So you've got power sector capital requirements, and this is what I'm talking about. This is the generation requirements to meet new peak electric demand, as well as a transmission, significant amount of transmission. And interestingly, we found that up in the Pacific Northwest, some of those that transmission analysis might be very important in terms of contributing to the overall costs. And so part of this effort was a detailed look at not just generation requirements, but those transmission requirements to connect new generators. And when you're building out a lot of new renewables that might be spread out over a large geographic area, the transmission costs could be very significant. We found that was a particular issue in the Pacific Northwest. And so when you roll all this up, I'm showing you the renewables only case. Again, that's the higher of the two. You roll it up, you get about $1.2 trillion in overall costs. Notice here, we don't have some costs, for example, associated with electric distribution infrastructure. That could be significant. But given how it may be necessary to do a deeper dive for a utility service territory in order to do that analysis right, that was outside the scope. So we don't look at electric distribution infrastructure requirements, nor do we look at natural gas distribution infrastructure. So as you remove gas customers from the gas system, you're saddling those remaining customers with fixed costs that must be recovered. So rates go up, and those costs need to be accounted for in this policy. That is not shown here, as we did not do that type of analysis. Now let's take those total costs and allocate them per converted household. And what we find is, in general, on average, about a 71% increase. Again, this is US annual average. I've got some regional data in a second, but on average, about 71% increase per converted customer as a result of the increased energy costs and the upstream infrastructure requirements. A couple observations on the renewable only case. The cost of emissions reductions are higher for a couple different reasons. We only applied the residential electrification policy in areas that we determined that it would actually generate emissions reductions. And that is dependent on how you meet new generation requirements and whether you're using renewables or some other fuel like natural gas. In the residential only case, all areas of the country did see emissions reductions as a result of residential electrification in 2035. And so in that case, we're including areas of the country like the Plains states, the Midwest, and others where it tends to be much colder. And those cold climates necessarily have higher heating requirements and could drive the costs even higher. Let me say for the Pacific Northwest, which is part of our broader West region, the electrification policy was applied to the West region in both the renewables only case and the market-based generation case. So there's no difference between those two cases and how the West was treated. And again, the number two, I mentioned this already, that the reductions in residential natural gas demand are partially offset by increases in electric generation due to the use of existing gas-fired capacity. Let me call that out for a second. One really interesting consequence of this renewables only case was that you have a lot of new electric demand, you have a lot of new peak electric demand associated with electrified residential end uses. And by restricting new natural gas, the model selected older natural gas and some coal and kept it from retiring. So in other words, in the reference case, some of these plants were going to retire, but because new natural gas wasn't stepping in to meet this new demand, the model said, well, we're going to keep these older plants from retiring, and then we're going to run them more. And older plants tend to be less efficient. And certainly if you're keeping a coal plant open and not building a new natural gas plant, the emissions will be higher in that case as well. So what we found is kind of an interesting side finding here, if you restrict new natural gas fired generation, you very well could incentivize older natural gas or older coal to continue to burn longer. So an interesting side finding there. The market-based generation case, again, this tended to be a lower cost emissions reduction case. Part of the reason is because we're not including all areas of the country. In this case, the Plain States, the Midwest, the Rockies, and also we didn't include those areas of the country in our electrification policy. So the overall total cost of the economy are somewhat smaller as a result of this generation case. And then two, again, the declines in natural gas demand. Let me put it this way. The CO2 emission reductions as a result of electrification, residential electrification, they're not quite as large because you're using more natural gas in the power sector than you would have otherwise. So the reductions in residential direct use emissions are offset more by emissions increases in the power sector. All right, so how does this policy look as I'll get that off the screen, as it compares to other potential greenhouse gas reduction measures? Simply put, it is a very costly approach to emissions reductions. And I'm not going to go through all of these other potential pathways. That wasn't the purpose of the study necessarily, but we did want to, juxtapose what the cost of emissions reductions look like relative to other ways you could reduce emissions. And if you're looking at an emissions reduction cost of almost $600 to $800 per metric ton of CO2 reduced, what you're saying is you're climbing that tree pretty high before you're picking the fruit. And there are potentially many other ways to reduce emissions, potentially a significant amount of emissions for a much lower cost per ton. And that's what this chart's meant to evoke. It just gives you a sense of, if you're looking at power sector greenhouse gas credits, look at California's carbon market, the EU's carbon market, order of magnitude or more lower than what residential electrification potentially costs as an emissions reduction measure. Even if you remove CO2 directly from the atmosphere, a recent study, I think it was in 2016, but they estimated costs of $94 to $230. That's from removing CO2 right out of the air, and that's still much lower cost than residential electrification as an emissions reduction measure. All right, I got a few slides on the regional output, and then I think I'll be able to wrap this up here in just a second. We can answer any questions. Just so you are aware of how we define the regions, the starting point was a look and examination of electric power pool and grid interconnections, and recognizing just the physical grid infrastructure and how we might start to look at different regions and define these areas. But also important were natural gas consumption profiles, regional climate and weather conditions, what electric grid emissions look like in 2035, so we knew where to apply the electrification policy. In other words, we weren't going to apply it if you weren't reducing emissions. And finally, all of this was heavily input by the AGA steering committee, and recognizing that this is ultimately a regional topic and different regions are going to come at this policy somewhat differently or very differently. And we tried to separate different parts of the country as a reflection of those different perspectives, and as well as the kind of physical attributes of both the grid, weather requirements, heating requirements, weather, and so forth. Just a quick regional breakdown of the study results. I've been giving you the results in terms of the averages. Okay, that's great, but where's my part of the country? As you can see, there is a fairly wide variation. In this case, we're looking at annual per household cost of electrification. This is the renewables only case, again, the higher case. The blue bar at the bottom, that represents what the costs per household were before the electrification policy was, and the colored bars on top of that are the direct consumer costs, and then the upstream power and transmission costs. So when you look at this, you say, okay, well, the West, which includes the Pacific Northwest, it's quite a bit lower than the average, and it's certainly a lot lower than, say, New York or New England, which makes sense. You don't have quite as deep winters, and therefore you don't have as high heating requirements, plus just differences in the makeup of the electric grid. I caution everyone from just immediately interpreting this chart and saying, okay, look, now we can go, this is the part of the country where electrification makes sense. Again, to remind you all, one thing we found is that the costs of electrification were positive in all areas of the country. In other words, this was a net cost to consumers no matter where you are. Two, there are significant cost differences within parts of these regions. The West includes part of Arizona, Southern California, all the way up the Pacific coast. So really, if you're going to do this analysis, you have to do it on a state and even more localized basis. And so the Pacific Northwest numbers are going to look different than even other parts of the West. And remember, these are conservative costs. We didn't look at electric distribution infrastructure. We didn't look at natural gas distribution, and there may even be other costs that we didn't account for that could drive the cost of this policy higher. And finally, since I have the slide, I'll show it here. The cost of emissions reductions in the West is still very high compared to other greenhouse gas emission reduction pathways. So yes, maybe the cost of the customer is lower than the national average, but if you look at the cost of emissions reductions for the West, between the market-based case and the renewables only case, it's still $500 to $750 per metric ton of CO2 reduced. This is an expensive emissions reduction policy, even in the West, and it should be viewed as such. In other words, just because you're out West doesn't mean you're not climbing that tree really high to start picking the fruit. And maybe there are more thoughtful pathways towards emissions reductions. I included the West regional results just so you could see those. All of this data is found in the report itself, but cumulative total change in CO2 emissions, this is 1 million metric tons. This is cumulative from 2023 to 2050. So while we only ran the electrification policy, the conversions out through 2035, we did not, we looked at the impacts of those policies out through 2050. And the emissions reductions are really quite modest when you accumulate them over that period of time. Very briefly, we're talking $43 billion change in consumer costs. On a per household basis, total cost of $66 to $75 billion, and on a per household basis, that's an incremental, additional above what they're already paying, an additional $5,000 to $6,000 over the lifetime of the equipment, or between $350 and $400 per year. So those are the results of what we see again for the broad Western region. I know there's a second part to this webinar, I would be remiss to not talk about very briefly the companion piece of work that we did in terms of a more thoughtful pathway towards emissions reduction. So we found that residential electrification, very expensive to reduce emissions. Perhaps there are better ways to do this, and perhaps natural gas can play a role in achieving lower cost greenhouse gas emissions reductions. This whole piece of work will be the topic for the next webinar that the AGA will participate on next month. But just a couple quick slides briefly, so in case you're not able to join us, at least you know that the work is there. One, we recognize that residential gas customers have been leading the way in CO2 emissions reductions for decades. And on a per customer basis, residential natural gas customers have reduced their emissions almost in half over the past 40 years. This is a result of conservation, efficiency, the result of natural gas efficiency programming. This is a good story, and we have a many-decade record of positive emissions reductions from this sector. How do we continue to step forward and play a role in driving future emissions reductions? We worked with a consultancy called Innovation Partners. They evaluated 100+ innovative natural gas technologies, and they found that new natural gas, innovative gas technologies that are available, or next generation technologies that could be available nearly in the future, in the near term, could drive 25 to 40% reduction in customer-based CO2 emissions. And they presented a vision where natural gas customers, or retaining that choice of natural gas for customers, is still consistent with deep greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and could be consistent with the 80% plus reductions by 2050, which would be consistent with the Paris Climate Agreement. But more on that later. Just briefly about how we're talking about this report. We are reaching out to stakeholders, and this webinar is part of that, and I appreciate your attention listening to me go on and on today. But we see this as a very important issue. This is very much a priority for our AGA's membership. And so among stakeholders such as yourselves, we've also been initially talking to various state and regulator groups. These conversations around electrification, the broader kind of scope here, have been happening largely without a gas industry perspective. And so with this report, with this analysis, we're hoping we can introduce some of these ideas, ask some of these questions, and think through what the implications of these broader electrification policies might be. So we were at both the regional NARUC meetings. I presented at the Western NARUC meeting. When was that? I think in June, actually. And we were at the national meeting in Phoenix in July. We are engaging in policy discussions both on a state level but also in DC as well. And we're going to continue to share this report with key stakeholders in DC. There's also work to be done to advance and expand on the ideas around how natural gas can continue to contribute to greenhouse gas emissions reductions. This is that kind of separate piece of work I only briefly alluded to here, and that we'll talk more about next month. And now I have a challenge on my desk. What's next? What are those follow-on studies? Where does this conversation go to? How do folks like yourself see AGA in doing additional analysis to advance the conversation in your neck of the woods? How do we contribute meaningfully to future analysis that helps you make and helps your regulators make good decisions around the cost, benefits, and implications of both electrification, residential electrification, but broader greenhouse gas emissions reduction policies. So we're always looking for feedback in that regard, and we'll be working with AGA membership in the future as we think through the next steps coming out of this effort. So with that, I've talked for a long time. Connor, I'll hand it over to you to shepherd us through the next piece here.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Richard. We've got about 15 minutes left here for questions. There's a lot of stuff that we just heard. There's a lot to it. I know that you guys have questions, so please go to the chat box there on the GoToMeeting control panel, type them there, and we will get to that. I'll give folks a few minutes to get those typed out. In the meantime, just want to, again, just express my appreciation to Richard for taking the time to do this. I think that this presentation plus the one next month is extremely thorough, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do it.
I do apologize. This was this is a distilled version of a year's worth of work. I'm just trying to understand and analyze this issue. So it is a lot. So and again, I encourage you can find this report. If you don't have it already, it's on the AGA website, and certainly, Connor, if you don't have the link already, I can give that to you to distribute to this group.
Sure. And we've got the first question here. I'll just read it out to you. Can you share with us why the initial report was focused on policy-driven residential electrification?
I think the idea here is that when we think through what electrification might mean from a policy perspective, you're in effect telling consumers, households, potentially businesses, they can't use natural gas anymore. And for us, our immediate one reaction is, well, that's limiting customer choice, and we are not for that. We are for customer choice, and that means we are being for customers choosing any measure. And maybe customers want to install a heat pump. We're not going to tell them they shouldn't. Our job, I see my role at AGA, is to advocate for natural gas and demonstrate the value that natural gas provides both customers and society more broadly. So we're not going to, we're not arguing against a market, driven approach or what consumers might choose in terms of their options or their choices for their end use energy. Rather, this is about evaluating the actual policy proposals that would limit that choice, and specifically limit natural gas as a fuel for customers to use in their homes and businesses. And so that's the idea, the impetus, and the reason why we focused on a policy-driven approach, because it really is the implications of these policies that have been put forward to drive residential electrification.
All right, we've got another question here. Are policymakers that you're talking with open to the discussion on continued use of fossil fuels or natural gas?
Can you say that once again?
Yeah, are the policymakers that you're talking to, presumably the team there at AGA, open to discussion on continued use of fossil fuels?
I suppose it depends on who you talk to. There's a wide spectrum of opinion on that question, and it depends on the context here. Again, this isn't just are we going to use fossil fuels or not question. This is about identifying what our shared objectives are. We agree that greenhouse gas emissions are important, and I will remind anyone I'm talking to that we at AGA and especially our members are committed to reducing the environmental footprint of their customers' energy use. Again, we have a 40-year history of precisely that, of the CO2 emissions from residential natural gas customers going down. And so how do we continue to make progress, and how do we ensure that natural gas has a role in helping reduce emissions? And again, that's part of that secondary piece, which is how do we step forward with innovative gas solutions to drive emissions reductions and help us achieve our shared goals of greenhouse gas reductions.
Great. So I'll give folks about 30 more seconds to enter any questions they might have. Once again, just want to remind folks that we're going to be back for part 2 of this on September 20th. I think we addressed there at the end some of the implications for natural gas moving forward, but we're going to get a lot deeper into that and really looking forward to that. We do have another question here. Is there any accepted standard for how different quantities of carbon emissions directly relate to different levels of global warming? Can the emissions reductions be tied to benefits?
So let me see if I got that question right. Is there a standard for how, like, what a certain amount of CO2 emissions reductions achieves in terms of benefits for the climate? Did I get that right?
Let's see. Is there a standard for that? Yeah, I think you've got that right. If we don't have that right, then
so
master's free too.
We didn't evaluate that. That's obviously outside of the scope of what we studied in this case. But what that question sounded like to me was, how do we evaluate potentially the social cost of carbon? And I believe that's actually on the chart that I showed earlier that looked at what the cost of emissions reductions were achievable through, or that would be achieved through this policy that we evaluated through residential electrification, and how that compares to, say, the social cost of carbon as established in the state of New York. Now, there's various ways you can estimate the social cost of carbon. That's a whole nother webinar itself, and in terms of how that goes. But that's effectively what we're talking about when we're evaluating the cost or the benefits from an emissions reduction. And again, those social costs of carbon tend to be much, much lower, or those median social costs of carbon, much, much lower than the costs we're seeing associated with residential electrification. I think that answers the question in a kind of different way. And if there's some more follow-up for that person, then I'd be happy to follow up with them.
Great. We got a couple more questions here. Can you confirm that the reductions in CO2 emissions is full life cycle of emissions from natural gas production and use?
So, I don't have my cheat sheet on methane emissions. One thing we didn't do is we did not do a full analysis on methane. Let me see if I can pull up. We did do some back of the envelope calculations. Part of the reason why methane was not included in this analysis is that it requires an in-depth look at how methane emissions would change in different parts of the energy economy as a result of this policy. So if we have a change in, say, natural gas production, that could change upstream methane emissions as well. It might change it from coal mining as well. And in other words, there's just a more dynamics that would have needed to be accounted for. However, the underlying conclusions don't materially change. I have some numbers, and I just apologize. I don't have those directly in front of me. Maybe we'll find them before I'm done here. But again, recognizing that on that very early on, I showed that chart. The share of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and I showed residential natural gas, is about 4%. This includes upstream impacts. So in other words, that's the full fuel cycle emissions impacts from natural gas on an annual basis. So if we're going to reduce natural gas from the residential sector and replace it with 100% clean energy, that would shrink that 4% to zero. Well, that's not what's happening as a result of these policies. So it's going to be somewhat less than that. And that's why we only see an emissions reduction potential of 1 to 1.5%. And that does not meaningfully change, at least based on our initial assessment of what happens when you include methane emissions. It doesn't materially alter our underlying conclusions.
All right, next question here. For the regions, why were New York and Texas listed separately, whereas other states like California were part of a larger region?
I'm sorry, say that again. I had a hard time hearing you.
Sure. On the map where you listed the various regions of your study, you see Texas and New York are separate, whereas California, say, is part of a larger Western region.
This was a subject that was much discussed as part of the how we were categorizing this. Texas is an easy one because it really is its own electric grid, and New York is has some of its own unique attributes that we could pull, that we selected to pull it apart. But this was a decision by the steering committee, recognizing that there's a lot of commonality across the West, and that even within states, that some of the results might be obscured by showing state-only bases. So this was just a choice as a result of the steering committee process and the outcome of that.
All right, we've got time for one last question here. So, is the assumption that end-of-life natural gas appliances would be required to shift to electric devices in 2023 based on policies being currently discussed, or is that assumption just for the purposes of this study?
The assumption is, well, so there's no hard and fast details with any of these particular policies. And so in other words, there's no policy out there that says, yes, by 2023, this starts. We did want to start. So when we created this policy, we had a grand debate about when this should begin. And we landed on 2023, which is close enough in the future that it's at least it's near enough in the future, 5 years out. And that seemed like a reasonable starting place. Before that, you've got things like building permits and other issues that we felt that it would just be too aggressive to start a policy case much before 2023. So that was a choice on our part. But recognizing that a lot of these policies out there don't have a lot of specifics in terms of how they're implemented associated with them.
Great. Well, we do not have time for any other questions, though the good news is Richard will be back again with us next month. So if you have additional questions, please feel free to bring them back next month, and we'll look forward to it. Appreciate it again, Richard, and we're looking forward to seeing you again.
And again, I'll share the link with you, and I'm happy to talk with anyone one-on-one if there's more details you'd like to discuss about the report. I'm happy to do so. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.